Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to round two, another episode of This is Revolution Podcast for all the returning listeners, subscribers, and of course, the very valued patrons. Thank you so much for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you do dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It's a passive gesture that goes a long way in promoting the channel. Just a brief reminder that if you are enjoying the wide variety of programming that we provide here on TIR, and you want to make sure we can stay on air to give you things like this TIR doubleheader, you want to join us for champagne rooms and movie nights, then become a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber. When you become a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber, you get champagne room and movie night access for as little as $3 a month and $30 for the year. You get the satisfaction of knowing that your small donation goes a long way, making sure that we can continue. Now, let's talk why the left can't overestimate its strength. Zoron Mandani's recent victory as mayor of New York City was nothing short of historic, not just because he's one of the most visible democratic socialists elected to a major U.S. office, but because of the political forces that made that win possible and the challenges that lie ahead. In a laborpolitics.com piece, It's Dangerous to Overestimate the Left's Strength, our guests tonight, Eric Blanc and Jacobin's Bhaskar Sankura, argue that while Zoran's campaign was a breakthrough, a quote, breakthrough for the left in many ways, it also reveals deep structural weaknesses in the organized socialist movement that can't be ignored. Mandani broke through not because of a massive, entrenched socialist movement, but because his message resonated broadly, particularly among young working-class voters and energized youth. And he turned economic frustration and disillusionment with establishment politics into turnout. In fact, the article points out that while campaign volunteers are a significant extension of organized power, quote, most of these people are only loosely engaged, unquote. And a major challenge now is turning this mass involvement into a durable movement capable of sustaining democratic socialist power in New York and beyond. Tonight, we're asking the big questions. How do we take 100,000 plus people who knocked on doors for Mandani and transform them into long-term organizers and cadre? How do we build socialist organizations that aren't just electoral, but rooted in workplaces, communities, and unions? And what lessons does this moment hold for socialists or radicals everywhere? To help unpack all of that, and to talk about what you can do wherever you are to combat ICE and build working class power from below, please welcome back to the show, longtime friend of the show and guest, Eric Blanc.
Hey. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming back. Where are we at here? There we go. I'm like, wait a minute, where do the questions go? The article argues, wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, there should be a link in the description to Eric's article. Your article argues that Zoran's victory was a breakthrough, but also warns it's dangerous to overestimate the left's strength. What does that mean in practical terms for socialists trying to build durable power beyond just one election?
I think we have this amazing opening and opportunity in New York City. And that doesn't really need to be belabored. You know, I think everybody understands how amazing it is to have a democratic socialist running the most important city in the country. The tension is, what is it going to take to sustain that movement? So it's not just a one-off. And I think part of what we're trying to push back against in this article is the idea that it's going to be enough just to deliver some policy wins to be able to sort of show that this was a success and it's going to continue with the momentum. There's two significant reasons why we don't think that's true, or at least it's one-sided. First of all, it's going to be hard to win the type of transformative policy wins that we need unless there's a dramatic extension of working class power. Because the reality is we won not just because Zoran had a good message, not just because he had an amazing volunteer crew, not just because the general crisis in the United States is leaving a lot of people open towards left politics, but also, and related to that last point, because the Democratic Party establishment is just so weak and fractured, and so in some ways we were able to seize a vacuum, but that in turn means that the base of this movement is much more fragile than certainly like predecessors, and we can talk about that maybe later. But if you compare where we're at today in New York City compared to like the sewer socialists that ran Milwaukee for 50 years, we have like a fraction of the strength. They led the entire labor movement, all of the unions. They had deep roots in all the neighborhoods. And just today, we are only beginning that process of like building a deeply rooted socialist movement.
Isn't that kind of one of the challenges? Like in reading that piece, and I was at, kind of coincidentally, I was having a conversation with a friend about something slightly different, but related. That what you're talking about with the sewer socialists is in Milwaukee, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about being rooted in the community, you live in an extremely, you're not from New York. It's a very transient city. So it's another thing, like, community ties. Where were these people? There was just different. Community looked a lot different in 1910 to 1950 than it does in 2026. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%. Although it's not so much, there's a few different things going here. If you think about how long people had been in Milwaukee, also not very long because it was mostly immigrants, but the density of like just day-to-day working class life is like another world compared to most parts of the country today, and also New York, which is to say that even before people were like part of the organized labor movement or left, there was already sort of like an associational culture where you go to the same bars after work, you go to the same churches, you had the same sports leagues, and then the labor movement, the social movement, the socialist movement sort of emerged out of that. And so you had two things going against you today. Is on the one hand, both that kind of like organic working class life, it's not completely gone, but it's much weaker than it was in the past and much more atomized for a million different reasons. But then also the left itself is much less rooted in that working class as a whole. And so, yeah, it is a really, really different situation. And it's just more challenging because you have a lot of like people who agree with socialist ideas, but they're not necessarily connected to all of their coworkers in the same way that they would have been 100 years ago.
That's a good point. The piece highlights that the volunteers who powered Zoran's campaign constitute an important extension of organized power into the broader working class. That's a quote from the piece. Yet most are only loosely engaged. How should democratic socialists think about that gap between campaign enthusiasm and sustained organizing?
Right. So as I mentioned before, so part of the difficulty is we don't have yet enough power both to win the big transformative gains we need, taxing the rich, universal childcare, but then also, as you mentioned here, what is it going to take to sustain the movement? And one of the big obstacles we have in this country is that people think of politics as essentially elections. And so at most you vote, and maybe if you're like a leftist, maybe you'll volunteer to elect somebody. But the norm, including for frankly a lot of the people who went out and door knocked for Zoran, is to assume, well, once they're in power, I go back to my daily life and I hope they do well. Or, if you're a crazy right winger, you hope they suffer and implode so you can just say that socialism doesn't work. But, the assumption is basically once the election happens, that's when the politicians do their thing. And the major sort of stake for what we're trying to argue in the piece is that we need to be able to convince hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers that that's not the case, that politics is not a sort of spectator sport, that they have to get in the fight. And we have to create easy ways for them to do that, because it's, everybody says, well, yeah, of course we want people involved, but the actual mechanisms to make it so that somebody who has kids, who has a job, and who has a lot of different things going on, and, agrees with Zoran and voted for Zoran, but who doesn't feel like they have something, or even never even consider that they might be the protagonist for winning the transformative New York. That's really the task that we have ahead, including starting with the 100,000 people who volunteered for Zoran.
I'm assuming you were one of those volunteers as well.
I was, yeah. And so is my 3-year-old Ellie, who's very effective. He's a Spanish speaker, and so it turns out it turns out that also if you have a 3-year-old passing out literature, that it's an extremely hard thing to say no to. Like even the people who are really against Zoran like have a difficulty saying no, and especially if the kid's speaking 2 different languages. So I've never had more success than with Ellie. So if anyone else wants to borrow Ellie for
for organizing purposes,
you can DM me.
How has the response been post the victory from the volunteer base? And I know some of it, a very small amount of it, got kind of, I guess I shouldn't say got as in it's done. There's still being kind of funneled into DSA.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the most notable dynamic is how many people have joined DSA. We've in New York City DSA, we've over doubled our membership, twice now in the last year. So we're just really, it's like up and away.
In DSA as a whole or New York?
In New York, although DSA as a whole has also grown. We're almost at 100,000 members for the first time. And if you look at when that chart starts going up, we had the graph was going down. We had like a peak in 2020 with Bernie, and then Biden years, and Gaza, and everything's depressing. And then literally it's when Zoran wins the primary, and then it starts going up again. And so there's been an influx of new people into DSA, as you could expect, because it was amazing. It wasn't just that we won politically, but I think that so many people feel isolated and powerless and want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And New York City DSA and DSA in many places provides that space where, you can meet people, you can feel part of a community, and you can kind of feel like you're actually doing something and not just doom scrolling. And I think that's, this may be underestimated, but the Zoran campaign was just like a really fun, positive experience. It was not like a dour affair. It was like if you were canvassing, or even if you were just walking around the city, like, I would always have my Zoran buttons and swag on, you would almost like every 3-4 minutes get a, thumbs up or a high five or whatever. It was really kind of a beautiful experience, and still is, to be able to just talk with strangers about something you have in common. And I think that sort of spirit is still at play, particularly with the people who then got involved in DSA. And so it wasn't just politics, it was also the sense of wanting to be part of something. And I think DSA has been a really beautiful place for that to happen. And there's other projects that are kind of more specifically fighting around winning Zoran's agenda. But I would say New York City DSA has really been at the center of it all.
I mean, that agenda, as he definitely has his critics, right? People are like, oh, this is just a whatever liberal agenda. It's like, it's still going to be very hard to get anything done in New York. One of the things that I thought was interesting about Zoran was his meeting with Trump. I mean, I really think it speaks to kind of how powerful politically he is in the way we view politics with personality, and how serious he is. I think he is the antidote to Trump's kind of kayfabe hold that he has on the political imagination. Even, he doesn't go out there and kind of just mindlessly slogan and talk a lot of bullshit. He's actually trying to get things done. So he's out of the camera's eye for the most part, which I find
and extremely earnest. He's like the most earnest guy.
I mean, I think he's a serious political figure.
Yeah.
Sure, maybe he is, but I that man is, from what I've seen, especially the way he handled the Trump thing, because the Trump thing, we don't have to necessarily get into that, but there was some, I don't want to say fear, but the way Trump kind of arrogantly was like, just tell him I'm a fascist. It's fine. I don't care. And, dude was kind of like, okay, yeah. Yeah, I think he is. And I'm going to sit here and have this conversation with dude. And Trump seems to, New York isn't on the agenda for whatever he wants to do to these blue cities.
I mean, we'll see. I hope that remains the case. Yeah, the Trump. I understand what Zoran did, and I think it was extremely effective. I still don't exactly understand why Trump responded the way he did. Like, that's still somewhat of a mystery to me. So, I'll leave that at that. But yeah, you're entirely right. Zoran has politics. I mean, that's another way of
Yeah.
saying it.
Yes.
There's like real politics and strategy behind what he does. And so that's why so many of these kind of like copycat Democrats of Zoran who think that it's just about like social media style or like how you talk to the camera really misunderstand, I think, fundamentally the political thrust of his campaign, which people understood too, and it stood out because he took a stand on Palestine in a moment when nobody else did, and so it resonated with being authentic. But the reason it was authentic wasn't sort of affect; it was because Zoran is deeply committed to socialism. He's a socialist, and his goal is to build working class power and democratize society. And I think that comes through. And he's at the same time extremely pragmatic, which is necessary, right? And I think you have to be sort of ruthlessly pragmatic. And balancing those two things is extremely difficult. But I think it's probably the only way forward. You need to be like deeply political. It's good to be a Marxist, have an analysis of this stuff. But you also need to be really flexible in your tactics because, we need a lot more power to get to what we need to do.
That's what I mean about him. I think he understands that in a way that his critics don't. Like, one of the things that I like to say on this show is it's easy to criticize. Like, that's kind of your job, is to have bad guys. People have to understand how the media functions and stop acting like the media is the vanguard of any sort of revolution. Like, stop that. Stop that. Like, we get to call people whatever name we want, and we don't have to have any sort of political affiliation. So I can say whatever I want about, oh, he's not doing enough, because I don't have to do goddamn thing. And neither does any other talking head.
Yeah, and it's funny though, because people think that's really transgressive. It's like, oh, why aren't you critical enough? Whatever. To me, the funny thing is actually what it seems to me that sort of mode of engagement with politics really reflects is actually the pervasive cynicism that most people have. That ultimately things aren't going to change. And so really what we're doing is criticizing from the outside, and it's the opposite of an organizer mentality. An organizer mentality is you look at where the world is right now and you figure out what are the steps you need to take to move in the direction where you need to go, and that's context specific. So you might want to get to socialism, and when you do, but you have to have a really rigorous analysis of how much power you have, how much your opponents have, what are the issues and mechanisms to start moving the relationship of forces. And he gets that. And, that being said, even it's an interesting test case. Even as he gets that, he's also now in a structural position where he's under an intense amount of pressure. And, I think he's doing a good job, but we can talk about this. But even somebody with as good politics as Zoran, I think that one of the tricky things is how you balance. This is why we wrote the article. How do you balance the fight for policy wins with the fight to build organization from below? Because these things can be in tension. Just to give a really concrete example, the ability of Zoran to pass some of these policies depends on having sort of a working relationship with Governor Kathy Hochul and some of the establishment Democrats. So it's a good thing he's building those relationships. But at the same time, he needs to be able to help build DSA and do things like primary some of these establishment Democrats. And that's going to be like the long-term organization building. But there's a tension there because, the establishment Democrats don't want to be primaried and they don't want Zoran allying with this. And so how he threads that needle is extremely difficult. And unless we from below put a lot of effort into organizing to make that organizing project viable and to create enough pressure so that Zoran keeps on siding with us and rather than the pressure from above, then there's going to be a natural progression, even for somebody as committed with politics as Zoran, to sort of bend to the pressure because the pressure from above is so much higher.
Well, that's, you talk about that reverse engineering a working class movement powerful enough to transform New York City. That's a quote from your piece. What exactly does that look like in unions, workplaces, and neighborhoods? What are the concrete steps that socialists in New York or just anywhere, because also we have a socialist mayor in Seattle as well. What concrete steps should socialists be taking right now?
Yeah, I think the most immediate fight in New York City is to tax the rich. And this has become even more urgent over the last few weeks because it's become known, and we didn't realize this, and Zoran didn't realize this, how much of a fiscal crisis New York is in because of Mayor Adams. And so there's a 12 billion deficit. And what this means is that unless we're able to start making the rich pay their fair share, it's going to be very difficult to pass these transformative reforms. And that's precisely why the billionaires are not going to want to tax the rich, because they don't want to see this work, because it's going to show proof of concept. So in the immediate, we need to be able to force Albany and Governor Hochul to pass the taxes on the rich. And the way we do that is by organizing our neighbors. And so it's, we're canvassing, we're sort of the same operation that we built up to get Zoran elected. Instead of folding it like Obama did, we're out there still every weekend. People can get involved if you go to New York City, DSA online, or you go to Our Time, which is the new organization that is fighting specifically for Zoran's agenda. We're going out and canvassing every weekend, talking with our neighbors to say, like, this is why we need you to not just sign this petition, but come up with this on Albany into the Capitol in late February. We're going to try to get 10,000 people to basically swarm the Capitol to say we demand that the rich be taxed. So part of it is building campaigns like this, but it's also, I think, just the really granular organizing work of like talking to your neighbors. Most of us live in apartment buildings, and the fight around the rent freeze is really central. Housing is the number one issue really in New York City, and Zoran is going to be able to freeze the rent, but that's going to immediately lend itself and sort of spark intense fights with all of these landlords who are going to say that he's putting these landlords out of business, and that they're not going to have money now to sort of make improvements to our buildings. And so that's going to immediately raise the question of organizing our tenants to both demand and our neighbors to demand that our landlords pay up, and that they don't use the excuse of a frozen rent to start, essentially like gutting our buildings. And frankly, a lot of those same landlords are going to already be, and they are planning on legally fighting to try to reverse, the rent freeze. And so unless we can organize literally millions of our neighbors in our buildings, then we're not going to be able to win the sort of keep the rent freeze and to start build the affordable New York City we need. So I think it's a lot of it, organizing is mostly talking with people who don't yet agree with you. And so that's at work, that's at your building. It's, I'm a parent, so it's talking with the random parents in our 3-year-old school. It's all of that stuff. And I think that the left essentially, and this is really the thrust of what I think when I mean by organizing, instead of just talking to each other, which is mostly what the left does, we need to actually go out and talk to people who aren't yet on board, or who maybe voted for Zoran but are not yet really convinced that they have anything to contribute to the movement, to say, like, this is why we need you, this is why you can make the difference.
I mean, you're getting me fired up. I mean, that's your job.
You can canvass with Ellie, as I mentioned.
Yeah, I need to come to New York, but it's fucking freezing there. It was 80 degrees today.
I don't need to hear it. I don't need to hear that.
Yeah, well, you wanted to go back east, so yeah, was it worth it?
It is actually funny about that, because so for listeners who don't know, I grew up in San Francisco, so it's what Jason was referring to a bit. But I went back to San Francisco for the first time just over winter break, and I took Ellie, my 3-year-old, and it's so beautiful. I forgot like how beautiful Northern California is, and the oceans and the redwoods and stuff. But the saving grace, because I would have had intense FOMO, is that we have a Democratic Socialist mayor. So I was like, okay, there's a reason I'm in New York City. So it's just, thank God for
you don't
Zoran.
Want big tech will save you from Trump.
Exactly. Good luck. You can have Gavin Newsom too. Just keep him to yourself.
Well, I'm in a different country. But yeah, we could talk about San Francisco all day long. How do you assess the interplay between social media, economic frustration, and political turnout in Mandani's campaign?
Yeah, it's a good question. On the one hand, it's not the case that Zoran is just sort of a success of social media. This is the probably most superficial takeaway of establishment Democrats is, oh, Zoran shows why you need to have videos or something like this, or that is sort of ridiculous, because there's plenty of establishment Democrats who are fine at doing social media. And in any case, the reason things resonated, and I think that's actually what I was trying to get at before about the earnestness, is that it was a little bit like Bernie, which is like Bernie's not so charismatic. Zoran is very charismatic, so sure, there's a difference there. But ultimately, it was the politics. Like, why did people like Bernie? Well, they liked what Bernie was saying. And it's the same with Zoran. Zoran, it wasn't actually so much stick, and sure, he's charismatic, but the politics that came through the social media is what there's a reason it went, a lot of the stuff went viral, and it wasn't just the sort of good comms as sort of as an art. That being said, the comms were really good. They had some of the best of the best. So it cuts both ways. I think you don't want to exaggerate. You can have good politics, and frankly, like unions are good examples. A lot of unions have very good politics and just have no idea how to get their message out to the masses. And Zoran was like really, really, really ambitious because he understood that he had to win a city of over 8 million people. And, part of that is knocking doors, but it also really helped when you're at the doors that you would go and knock the door and somebody had seen, oh, that's the guy I just saw on, like on my phone. Right. Yeah. And so the social media piece actually really was important. And I do think there's a lesson there. And I think the right wing has been much better than the left at understanding the new media environment and really waging the battle of ideas. And so that's what's, I think, so exciting about Zoran's comms game. It wasn't just about Zoran. In some ways, it was never about Zoran. The singular thing about his campaign were these 3 policy planks, right? Mm-hmm. It was all about freezing the rent, universal childcare, and fast and free buses. And so that cut through in a different way because it was kind of about the platform, and it was about the fight in New York City, and it was positive, and I think there's something to be said for that, and it was very celebratory. So the comms piece was important, but it was mostly important because it got these ideas out, and then also it fed in to the organizing. So the comms wasn't like a separate thing unto itself. It was that every time you had a viral video, you would get another 1,000 volunteers, right? Mm-hmm. And it was that sort of interplay then became really, really crucial.
There's a lot of comparison with Zoran and Bernie. Why is there not the same kind of comparison with Zoran and AOC? When I think of viral videos, I think of her run after Bernie and how everybody was on board for AOC. She got so much money that wasn't from even her district. Zoran seems a little similar in that regard. And to your point about anyone can make a video, we kind of saw how it is monkey see, monkey do. So AOC had a really well done video that showed the shoes. She walked all over Queens. So I need to show a video of me walking all over a city, that I'm here, I'm entrenched in the community, and I want to be your blah, blah, blah. That didn't work out for everybody after AOC.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, AOC did sort of play a central role in leading to some other wins. So the squad got extended, and you had Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. So there was some sort of knockoff effects. But I think ultimately, the reason I come back to Bernie is I think this is all Bernie politics. AOC has Bernie politics, especially these days. Zoran has Bernie politics. They were both Bernie volunteers. And so I think that ultimately I look at the real turning point of the left as 2016, where there was a real shift towards thinking about what it takes to do majoritarian politics, and how you combine bottom-up organizing with relating to the Democratic Party. And yeah, so AOC, sure, 100%. I think AOC, we wouldn't have Zoran without AOC, for a variety of different reasons. But AOC really was something that put a huge amount of legitimacy to New York City DSA, right? And that project now has culminated in winning the mayorship. And AOC, if anything, one of the differences with Bernie is that she's, a DSA member. And so that I think, if anything, she's been closer to helping build that party building project than Bernie. And yeah, so in that sense, I think we do have a lot of precedent.
Looking beyond New York, what lessons do you think the article holds for other socialist organizers in smaller cities or towns that lack a critical mass of activists, like 100,000 people? How can the deep movement building happen in context without large DSA chapters or even high electoral visibility?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I frame it a little bit differently because we didn't have 100,000 volunteers in before this campaign. And frankly, we were sort of getting our butts kicked in some recent elections. There was a lot of talk that the Democratic Socialist momentum has declined. We had lost, a lot of our races. Everything sucked. Frankly, that was not that long ago. And in the context of everything sucking and then Trump getting elected, it seemed fanciful to a lot of people that, oh, you're going to try to win New York City now, right? Like even your average DSA member at first, if we're being honest, supported Zohran if they did, because they thought like, well, at least we need to have some sort of intervention. It was not, Zohran, I think, was one of the few people who really truly believed he could win. I think most of the rest of us, I would say, including myself, be like, great, like we need to have somebody who can get our politics out there because it sucks when you don't. Like we just gone through 2024, right? And we saw how bad it was for the left not to have anybody sort of running for president. So that dream of something so ambitious became a reality. It didn't, and it sort of, the movement emerged not before, but through that. And I think there's a lesson there for the sort of left and organizers anywhere you're at, which is that at this moment, and I really would stress that it's not like Zoran couldn't have happened 3 years ago. He couldn't have happened 1 year ago. There's something about the depth of the crisis in American politics, on one hand, Trumpism, and then just the deep, deep discrediting of the Democratic Party that creates an unprecedented opening for the left. And so I don't think that that's particular to New York at all. I don't think that there's something specific about the water in New York. We see that in Seattle is a good example, but really everywhere. There's so much anger, both at what Trump is doing and then also the inability and unwillingness of the Democratic Party leadership to fight that in a serious way. Yeah. So I think that the big lesson is to be ambitious. And if you don't have like an army right now, you can build that army in the fight. Like Minneapolis didn't really have like the army that they have right now, nonviolent army. I don't want to get.
Yeah, that's all we need now. I got to cross the border in a couple weeks.
Exactly. So,
now I can't see my family because
yes, nonviolent. But the fight. It's in the fight that ordinary people get involved, and I think that you need to understand that it's through the specific fights that people feel strongly about. That's how ordinary people get involved. So that's what I would look for. Is like probably in most places right now, it's the fight against ICE and the fight to run Democratic Socialists or other working class candidates for office. Those seem to me to be two very widely and deeply felt sort of concerns all across the country.
Is Trump the accelerationist dream come true? Like, is Mark Fisher right now doing cartwheels in his grave, going, "Why couldn't this have happened sooner?" Because it seems like the failures in Trump 2.0 are way bigger than the first time around. Like people already forget, right? We have a gnat-like memory of time, especially after the pandemic. But Trump walks in the door with kids in cages and child separation policy, and that was a big deal. And immigration is something that he's always ran on because it's a great political football for him. And he likes to do things like bigger and better than anyone else. And I'm saying that with like finger quotations, bigger and better than anyone else. And so to kind of take ICE out of the whole like job rate thing, like let's just occupy a city with ICE. That has been a massive, massive failing for him. And then, earlier I talked with Matt Huber about Venezuela being kind of this huge waste of time. Even mainstream media is like, we can't make anything of this. We can't say it's good. There's no oil. Oil companies weren't behind this. This is not what we're used to seeing in American imperialist politics. There's usually capital behind these moves. Capital's not behind that. Because of these failings, these massive failings, they've even backed away from the DEI stuff because that would be the one terrain they probably could win on. They even backed away from there. Are these failings helping in some regard for the Zorons to come through? Because the Democratic Party is going to do everything in their power to lose whatever door Trump is opening.
Yeah, I mean, all other things being equal, I don't think it's the case that the worse things get, the better for the left, but for a variety of reasons is things getting worse. Sometimes people turn inwards, right? They feel more despair. So much of what we're trying to do is giving people a sense of hope and that things can get better. And frankly, one of the really horrible things about Trump is that it's lowered expectations so much. It's just one horrible thing after another that at this point it feels like if just something bad that's new doesn't happen, or like, oh, it's like this was a good week, right? Like we're not invading a new country. So it's like has a way of lowering expectations. That being said, I do think that we're in a moment of incredible promise for the American left and the working class. And that I think that gets underestimated. The analogy I think about is World War II, when so much of the capitalist class across Europe collaborated with fascists. And that so discredited the capitalist system that after the war, when resistance and the fascists were defeated, it set the basis for the biggest gains for social democracy and for socialist movements that really the world has ever seen. And I think that the promise and potential of this crisis we're in is that if we can defeat Trump, and if we can do that in particular in a way that is not like Gavin Newsom getting elected and we just sort of rinse and repeat the same cycle as always, where we get some shitty Democrat and then the Republicans are worse the next time, which is a possibility. I think that's possible. But if we're able to, through kind of a mass movement and left electoral approach, get into a new dynamic post Trump where we prevent him from stealing the election, which is a big if. I want to sort of like, I don't want to like skip over that too quickly. There's a real danger that they just destroy completely American democracy, which they're trying to do. And I think that there's going to be a huge fight to stop that from happening. I don't think that it's going to be like just we win the midterms and they go away quietly into the night. I think it's really unlikely that we're going to be able to win without a huge amount of mass disruption from below. Something like Minneapolis, but times the whole country to prevent, them from doing what they want to do. But that seems to me possible because Trump is so unpopular. This stuff is so unpopular. And in that sense, we're getting a little lucky. I actually thought that Trump was going to be like a little savvier, like pick his fights a little bit better, do, maybe some populist stuff or like, try to juice the economy. The fact that they're just going so hard on such unpopular things means that we have real potential for defeating Trump. And if that takes place in a way that there's a lot of bottom-up energy, well, think about how discredited not just the Democratic Party establishment has been, but the entire capitalist class. They all bent the knee. They all have been bending the knee. And people see that. And that's, people aren't going to forget that. They're not going to forget that who was that inauguration? Zuckerberg, Bezos, Elon Musk, all these fuckers, people have memories, and that's going to set into motion a possibility for the post-Trump era to be very anti-corporate, to be very social democratic in the best possible way. And we need to seize that moment. And I think we need to be sort of hopeful that that is a possibility. Things like Medicare for all becoming on the agenda, things like radically democratizing the political system by, packing the Supreme Court, expanding it, Puerto Rico, DC, getting rid of so many of the institutional roadblocks. I think all of these things are on the agenda because the system clearly was not working and is not working. And the only people who are going to save it is the working class and the left. So I do think that, I don't know if that means I don't think Trump was a good thing. There has to have been a better way to have gotten to where we need to get than so much suffering, but it is where we're at.
I've just been reading some literature about accelerationism and kind of its failures and the end of Fisher's life, and we don't need to stay on that topic for too long. But as far as organizing labor, I'm sure you're aware about organizing gig workers in California and how they are allowed to unionize and how huge this could be. Over 800,000 strong. What is the organizing effort looking like in NYC or in general? Are all eyes on California right now? Or how is everybody approaching this? Because this seems like the perfect moment. The iron can literally not get any hotter.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the openings in California are really important for gig workers, and I think my sense of it is that part of the obstacle is not just the law on the statewide level getting better, but the sense of sort of hopelessness. And I feel like in New York, the number one thing we have going for us, even more so than California, is that sense of hopelessness has not gone away, but is significantly dissipated. And that's so important because, the reality is you could have good laws on the books in California, and they've had that, for instance, for some fast food workers. And the obstacle is having good laws on the book helps a lot. I don't want to downplay it, but you still need to have a mechanism for people to like feel like they can fight back and win. And what's nice about having Zohran in power is if people have gone through this experience just now of being told that he could never win, and the powers that be were proven wrong. So there's a recent experience of sort of showing that the impossible is possible, but then also you have a person in power who's actively boosting labor struggles. So you have Zohran, unlike all the previous administration, walking the picket line with the nurses who are on strike.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge opening in New York, and this is sort of analogous to gig workers. The Amazon drivers are very hard to organize because they're technically contracted. They don't technically work for Amazon, even though they actually do work for Amazon. And so there's going to be a city council law passed very soon that will enable unions to organize them in New York City. And that's just going to be an amazing fight because, people hate Jeff Bezos, and Zoran, I think, can play a really important role in boosting up all of these, mostly young working class kids who are driving in the city, and it's these low wage workers. And I think that here is going to be a very explosive fight.
Well, that left political power does not lie in California. With the mayors, with the city government, or with the state government, and of course at the top with the governor. So let's just say magical things happen, and we get stranger things have happened. There's a union at Starbucks. We get a gig work union. Are you saying the state would just work with capital to make sure that union is extremely ineffective?
No, I don't think so. I think my worry more is just like how do you get the union? How do you get it to be real? Like, you're talking about millions and tens of millions of workers, and that's the hardest part. And so I think so much of it is raising expectations. So no, I mean, I think you can win in California, but the question is, like, right now, the number one factor that is always the case is so many people are scared to organize because they don't want to get fired, and they're trying to keep their heads down. Like, that's the obstacle that we face in California everywhere else. And it's just a little bit easier to overcome that when you have a mayor actively encouraging you to, take that risk and saying, I'm going to have your back. And, it doesn't mean you can't do it elsewhere, but it's easier when you have something like that.
Are you somewhat hopeful for the union organization? Gig workers make up a massive part of the workforce.
Yeah.
That kind of gets ignored to a certain degree because I think people feel like it's just too big of a lift to try to organize a group of people that are just, some people really do it on the side. Some people, it really is their only gig. Some people are going to do it for 5 minutes until the next thing takes off for them. But they make up, like you said, tens of millions of people across the country, if not more. That could be an extremely powerful organization.
Yeah, I agree. And, and this goes a little bit to what I was saying before, is part of the tricky thing with gig work is that it's both like the most exploited. Really, these are, this is like the parts of the working class that's just most exploited and lowest paid. But in part because of that, it tends to be harder to organize gig work, both because people have like 3 different jobs, but then also the absence of a like clear workplace in common oftentimes is like a real tricky thing. So I think that the way you're going to organize gig work is going to be different than sort of traditional union organizing. It's going to have to be more like a real social movement because there's not necessarily going to be that you're just having one-on-one conversations with your coworkers, it's going to be much more explosive and feel more like sort of the Minnesota uprising right now, where you have people taking to the streets and fighting and, and sitting in, non-violently fighting. I just have to be careful. And so I do think that that's what we have to be looking for, is how to build these kind of viral bottom-up movements, particularly for gig work, where people are really dispersed, and that's an obstacle. But if you can get those workers in motion, then all bets are off.
And before you go, I do want to talk a little bit about some of your most recent pieces, which have been about how you can fight back against ICE. What can listeners in their own communities and workplaces do right now to begin closing the gap and build real power against corporations, ICE, and the forces that deny working people justice?
Yeah, I think people are overwhelmingly against ICE, and there's also a sense of like, what do we do? Just going another protest is good, but it's clearly not enough. One of the things that me and some collaborators have been pushing on is an understanding that ICE can only function with the active backing of the private sector. So in part, that's true for the whole regime, Trump regime as a whole, but it's particularly true with ICE in part because it's scaled up so quickly. So for instance, ICE needs to depend on hotels, and that's where they're sleeping. They're sleeping at Hilton hotels in Minneapolis. And if they have nowhere to sleep, then it's very difficult for ICE to function. They depend on enterprise rental cars for renting cars to get around the city. They depend on catering and restaurants to eat their food. And so part of the sort of strategic orientation we're pushing for is that when we understand that ICE is in many ways dependent on the private sector, that opens up all sorts of possibilities for us to understand our own leverage to stop ICE. And we have plenty of examples of that recently, where, for instance, Avelo Airlines, which is an airline company that was doing charter flights for ICE deportations out of the country. There was 8 months of campaigning from unionists, from DSA, from immigrant rights groups to demand Avelo break its ties with its ICE contract. And just 2 weeks ago, they broke that contract. And I think that is something that can happen sort of across the board. There's no reason we can't force Hilton nationwide to stop housing ICE. That happened in Minneapolis. People might remember this. It was a couple of weeks ago when Hilton refused to house ICE, and then DHS and Trump freaked out, and the national Hilton sort of walked it back. But that local business stopped housing ICE, and they still are not housing ICE. And that's the proof of concept that we need, that everywhere, no matter where you're at, even if there's not like an ICE surge in your city, you can go organize at a Hilton protest where people are going out banging pots and pans inside the lobby or outside in front to basically demand Hilton break from ICE and stop housing ICE. You can go to your local Target, which has been collaborating with ICE. You can go to your Home Depot, which has been collaborating with ICE. There's all of these companies, and we have a full list of them on the piece we wrote, which I have on laborpolitics.com, with the different corporate entities that are collaborating. And I would just say so many of us work for these companies or buy from these companies, and you should, at this moment, get involved in the fight to demand that those companies that you're either working for or supporting with your dollar stop working with ICE. And so the Sunrise Movement is organizing around Hilton. There's a lot of different sort of initiatives that folks can take. I would say that if you're an employee at any company, frankly, that is collaborating with ICE, then I'd suggest reaching out to EWOC, the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which supports any worker in any industry to fight back against ICE or around any issue. So you can go to organizeworkers.org. And just, now's the time. This is the moment. Like this is not a drill. We are in the fight against authoritarianism. And if we don't win, then it's going to be really, really bad. But if we do win, it's going to be really, really good. And so, take stock of where you're at and do everything you can. I personally feel much less bad than I did a year or two ago when I was just sort of like doom scrolling because there's a genocide. Like right now it's scary, but I feel like we're in the fight and you're with comrades and, we can win it. And that feeling of being part of something is infectious. And I hope more of your listeners who haven't yet experienced that get a chance to.
Well, I've been surprised. Even my high school is doing a walkout tomorrow.
Amazing.
So it's happening. It's happening. Recently, some more schools in Oakland had a walkout the other day. I'm sure you saw that in the news.
I saw that. Yeah. Amazing.
So there's some things.
What high school? What high school is walking out that you went to?
I went to Albany High.
Albany High, yeah, of course. Great.
Class of 1995. So I think Oakland Tech, and I can't remember the other schools that walked out the other day. So,
I saw that. That was great. Yeah, I think the high school kids is like really crucial. That's the first strike that they had in Minneapolis was high school students walking out. So hopefully we see that across the country.
There's definitely some things that are going on. I don't know if you saw that Tom Homan speech today. It was horrible. We're going to get ICE out of the cities and get them in the prisons. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
I've been doing my best to not be as online because this is good. Maybe it's a good thing to leave on. It turns out the day feels less horrible when you're doing organizing and not as online.
Because you're doing actual. That's the difference, right?
Yeah.
You're actually doing things in the community. You're meeting your neighbors, and you can feel the difference that it's making compared to listening to, the border czar who took a bag of cash say, it felt like he found a script from a Death Wish movie and was just reading off the plot points.
You can spend all day just seeing the crazy shit they're saying. And so, it's hard. I'm as addicted to this stuff as anybody else, but like I'm trying to invoke some modicum of discipline because the moment demands it.
I caught it on accident. And again, I know what I do for a living, so it's kind of my job, but maybe I need to find a better job. Look, thank you, Eric, for taking the time to talk to me. I know you got grown man daddy stuff to do. And
such as sleeping, yes.
And have a good rest of your day. What are you working on next?
Everything I'm working on these days is how do we stop ICE? So, that's really the thing I'm like obsessed with these days. How do we get these campaigns up and running to get the universities to break from ICE, get these companies to break from ICE? So that's all I'm thinking about. So reach out to me if you're out there and you want to get your company to break with ICE.
Wherever you guys are watching or listening to this show, there's a link in the description to Labor Politics so you can see Eric's piece and you can read everything he's got up about how you too can fight against ICE. Eric, have a very good rest of your evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Peace, brother. Now, I'll see you guys Saturday morning. We'll be talking about Iran, another fun topic. Good times over here at TIR. Thank you guys so much. And again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description. Before we even talk about the show, the link is to Eric's piece. And I'll see you guys Saturday. And don't forget, my piece is up right now in Current Affairs. It's finally online. I forget what they call it because I originally called it hot Cheeto behavior. I didn't get to keep my title. I never get to keep my titles. Just know that I have some very funny titles if you are between the ages of 38 and 52. All right, I'm going to say goodnight to Eric when credits roll. See you guys. I am out.